The first Monday note I ever read was gone before I reached the notice board. A woman wearing a gray coat pulled the paper away, folded it into her bag, and walked across Maple Square without looking back. Nobody tried to stop her. An elderly man sighed quietly, a schoolboy looked disappointed, and the owner of the nearby flower shop gently shook her head before returning to arrange fresh flowers outside her door. I stood there wondering why one small piece of paper could change the mood of an entire square. My name is Tessa Monroe, and I had crossed Maple Square almost every weekday for the past 3 years. My apartment was only a 15-minute walk from the City Museum, where I worked as a conservator. My days followed the same comfortable pattern. I left home at 8 o'clock, bought tea from the same corner stand, crossed the square, and reached the museum before the first visitors arrived. Some people thought my job sounded boring, but I never agreed with them. I spent my days repairing old paintings, restoring damaged letters, and protecting family photographs that carried memories from another time. Every object told a story, even if it had been forgotten for many years. I believed forgotten things deserved another chance, and perhaps that was why I loved my work so much. As I entered the museum, my colleague Iris Holloway noticed that I seemed distracted. She had worked beside me for almost 6 years and understood my expressions better than anyone else. She carefully placed an old book inside a protective box before smiling at me. "You look as though something unexpected happened this morning," she said. "I saw people standing around the notice board in the square," I replied. Someone removed a handwritten note, and everyone looked disappointed. Iris smiled knowingly. "So today was the day you finally noticed the Monday notes." I frowned slightly. "The Monday notes?" She nodded. "They have appeared almost every Monday for nearly 2 years. Nobody knows who writes them, but half the neighborhood reads them before going to work." I laughed quietly because I thought she was joking. "You expect me to believe people gather every week just to read one anonymous sentence?" "I don't expect you to believe me," she answered. "I think you'll find out for yourself." Before I could ask another question, the museum opened its doors to visitors. The morning became busy, and I tried to forget our conversation. An elderly couple brought us an old family diary that had been damaged by water. Several pages had become difficult to read, but one sentence remained perfectly clear. "Hope is a quiet guest. It arrives before you notice it." I smiled while carefully cleaning the page. I did not know why those words stayed in my mind, but they followed me throughout the afternoon. Sometimes understanding a sentence does not depend on difficult vocabulary. When we understand the situation around the words, their meaning becomes much clearer. That is one reason stories make language easier to remember. On my way home, I crossed Maple Square again. The notice board looked completely ordinary. There were advertisements for piano lessons, a missing bicycle, a weekend market, and a charity concert. Nothing suggested that people had gathered there only a few hours earlier. Even so, I found myself stopping for a moment before continuing home. The following Monday, I left my apartment 10 minutes earlier than usual. I told myself I wanted a slower walk before work, but I knew the real reason. I wanted to see whether Iris had been telling the truth. When I reached the square, several people were already standing near the notice board. Nobody spoke loudly. Some smiled quietly, while others simply read the message and continued walking. It felt almost like a small tradition shared by strangers. I stepped closer until I could read the paper. The world becomes quieter when people stop listening. Today, give someone your full attention. There was no signature, only neat handwriting on cream-colored paper. The message was simple: but something about it felt sincere. As I turned away, I noticed a little boy asking his grandfather to read the note aloud one more time. The old man smiled patiently and read every word again, this time more slowly. The boy thanked him before they continued toward school together. I could not explain why that small moment stayed with me all day. Later that afternoon, a visitor came to the museum carrying a wooden picture frame that had belonged to her grandmother. One corner had broken during a move, and she hoped we could repair it. While examining the frame, I noticed fresh oak had already been added to strengthen the damaged section. "Who repaired this?" I asked. "A local carpenter," the woman replied. "His workshop is beside Maple Square. His name is Callum Reed." She smiled warmly. "He never rushes his work. My husband says he repairs furniture the way other people look after friends." Her words surprised me because they reminded me of my own work. Good repairs should never attract attention. They should simply allow something valuable to continue its life. That evening, as I crossed the square again, I noticed a man kneeling beside one of the wooden benches. A toolbox rested beside him while he tightened loose screws and sanded rough edges until the wood felt smooth again. An elderly woman thanked him before sitting down with her shopping bags. The man smiled politely. "I'm glad it feels safer now," he said. He packed away his tools without waiting for more praise. I wondered if that was Callum Reed. The following Monday, another message appeared on the notice board. Kindness is often remembered long after the person who offered it has gone home. This time, I noticed something new. People were not only reading the note, some were changing because of it. A young woman helped an elderly neighbor carry heavy shopping bags across the square. A baker walked outside with a basket of warm bread and handed 2 rolls to a homeless man sitting near the fountain. A teenage girl returned a lost scarf that she could easily have ignored. Perhaps those people would have acted kindly anyway. Perhaps the note simply reminded them to notice the chance. As the weeks passed, Monday mornings slowly became my favorite part of the week. I no longer hurried across the square with my thoughts fixed on work. Instead, I arrived a little earlier, read the newest message, and quietly watched the neighborhood wake up around me. One rainy Monday, I noticed the man with the toolbox again. Heavy rain had begun before sunrise, and the paper on the notice board had started to curl at the corners. Without saying a word, he carefully placed a clear cover over the message so people could continue reading it without the rain damaging the paper. A little girl looked up at him and smiled. "Thank you," she said. He smiled back. "I think some words are worth protecting." I heard his answer as I stood beneath my umbrella. For reasons I did not understand, those 5 words stayed with me longer than the Monday note itself. Later that day, I asked Evelyn, the flower shop owner, whether she knew the carpenter. She nodded immediately. "Everyone knows Callum. Does he always help around the square?" "He does," she replied. "He fixes benches, repairs the notice board, and never sends anyone a bill. He says this square has given him more than he could ever repay." I looked toward the notice board. "What do you think he means?" Evelyn smiled gently. "Only Callum knows the answer to that." 2 Mondays later, I reached the square expecting another handwritten message. Instead, an official notice covered the center of the board. "Notice this. Community notice board will be removed in 4 weeks as part of the town redevelopment project." People stood silently reading the announcement. No Monday message waited beneath it. No familiar handwriting welcomed the beginning of the week. The little boy who usually came with his grandfather looked around with a confused expression. The baker slowly folded his apron and stared at the empty space. Even Evelyn's smile disappeared. As I looked at the board, I realized something I had never expected. Those anonymous Monday notes had quietly become part of my own routine, and I was not ready to lose something that had brought hope to so many strangers. Before I share the rest of the story, I need to know, where are you listening from? I would love to hear from you. For the rest of that Monday, I could not stop thinking about the empty notice board. The official announcement stayed in my mind while I worked at the museum. Every time I looked at an old painting or carefully repaired a damaged photograph, I found myself thinking about the board in Maple Square. It was strange how something so ordinary had become important to me in only a few weeks. I finally understood what Iris had meant when she said people discovered the Monday notes when they needed them most. The next morning, a teacher visited the museum with a group of students. They were learning about old documents and wanted to see how they were protected. One little girl pointed at a faded letter and asked me why anyone would spend so much time repairing a piece of old paper. I smiled before answering. Because every letter carries a story, I said. If we protect the paper, we also protect the person's voice. The teacher thanked me, and the children continued walking through the gallery. As I watched them leave, I realized that the Monday notes did exactly the same thing. They protected something invisible. They reminded people that kindness could still exist in the middle of an ordinary day. That afternoon, I crossed Maple Square a little more slowly than usual. Callum was repairing one of the wooden flower boxes outside Evelyn's shop. He was carefully replacing a broken piece of wood, while Evelyn watered bright yellow flowers beside him. "You work very hard," I said before I could change my mind. He looked up and smiled. "I enjoy fixing things. I've noticed." He laughed quietly. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. Instead, it felt peaceful, like sitting beside someone who did not expect you to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Evelyn smiled as she looked at both of us. "Tessa, have you met Callum properly?" I shook my head. "No. We've only seen each other around the square." Callum wiped his hands on a clean cloth before offering one of them to me. "I'm Callum Reed, Tessa Monroe. It's nice to finally know your name." His voice sounded exactly as calm as I had imagined. Before leaving, I looked at the empty notice board once more. "I'll miss the Monday notes," I admitted. Callum looked toward the board for a brief second. "So will I." His answer was short, but something in his expression made me think he wanted to say more. The following Monday arrived with cold wind and gray clouds. People still stopped beside the notice board, even though there was no new message waiting for them. Some read the official announcement again, while others simply looked at the empty space before continuing toward work. I stayed there longer than usual. The silence around the board felt heavier every week. As I turned to leave, I noticed a small white envelope lying beneath the bench nearby. It had no name written on it. Inside was a blank sheet of cream-colored paper, nothing else. I looked around the square, but nobody seemed to be searching for it. I slipped the paper into my notebook and continued walking. At work, I kept thinking about that empty page. It reminded me of the letters I restored every day. Every letter had started exactly the same way, with a blank page waiting for someone to be brave enough to write the first sentence. Learning a language often feels similar. The first conversation can seem frightening, but every confident speaker once stood in front of an empty page or a difficult sentence Progress begins when we decide to try instead of waiting to become perfect. That evening, I opened my notebook after dinner. The blank page was still there. Without planning to, I picked up my pen. For several minutes, I stared at the paper without writing anything. Then I remembered the little boy listening to his grandfather, the baker sharing bread with a stranger, and the man who quietly repaired benches without asking for anything in return. Slowly, I began writing, "To the person who wrote the Monday notes, thank you for reminding people to notice each other. I do not know your name, but your words have changed this square in ways you may never see. If you are still reading these messages, I hope you know they mattered." I folded the letter carefully. Early the next morning, before most of the shops had opened, I walked to Maple Square. The streets were almost empty. Only Evelyn was arranging flowers outside her shop. She smiled when she saw me. "You are here early." I couldn't sleep. She looked at the folded paper in my hand but did not ask any questions. Instead, she quietly returned to her flowers. I pinned my letter beneath the redevelopment notice and stepped back. For a moment, I wondered whether I had made a foolish decision. Then I remembered something I often told museum visitors. Every story begins because someone decides to write the first sentence. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. By Friday evening, my letter was still hanging on the board. I told myself not to expect an answer. The following Monday, I almost convinced myself to walk straight to work without looking. Instead, I stopped beside the board one more time. My letter had disappeared. A fresh page now rested in its place. My hands trembled slightly as I stepped closer. The handwriting looked familiar. "Thank you for believing these notes were worth reading. I almost stopped writing because I thought people no longer needed them. Your letter reminded me that hope becomes stronger when it is shared. Please don't stop believing in small acts of kindness." There was still no signature. I smiled without realizing it. Someone had answered me. As I carefully folded the reply and placed it inside my notebook, I noticed Callum standing across the square outside his workshop. He was helping the little boy fasten a loose wheel on his bicycle. When the repair was finished, the child rode away laughing. Callum watched him disappear down the street before quietly returning to his work. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the square. He smiled politely. I smiled back. Without knowing why, I had the feeling that two different stories had just begun to move toward the same ending. I read the anonymous reply 3 more times before putting it safely inside my notebook. For the rest of the morning, I could not stop thinking about it. The writer had sounded hopeful again, but one question remained in my mind. Who was this person, and why had they almost stopped writing? The answer seemed close, yet I could not see it clearly. That afternoon, I returned to Maple Square after work. The notice board stood quietly beneath the old maple tree while people paused to read the newest message. A young nurse smiled before walking toward the bus stop. An elderly couple held hands as they continued across the square. Even the busy baker slowed down long enough to read every word before opening his shop. I finally understood that the Monday notes had never been about perfect advice. They reminded people to notice one another. That simple habit had quietly changed the square. As I turned to leave, I saw Callum carrying several wooden boards toward his workshop. Without thinking, I walked over to help him. "These look heavy," I said. "They are," he replied with a smile. "Thank you." Together, we carried the wood inside. His workshop smelled of fresh pine, warm coffee, and clean sawdust. Wooden shelves covered one wall, while finished chairs and tables stood neatly beside the windows. Everything looked simple, but every piece had been made with great care. "You built all of these?" I asked. Callum nodded. "I enjoy making things that last." His answer reminded me of the museum. "I suppose we have similar jobs," I said. He looked curious. "How so?" "You build new things that people will keep for years. I protect old things that people almost forgot." He smiled. "I've never thought about it that way." For a few moments, we talked about our work instead of the notice board. The conversation felt easy. Neither of us needed to impress the other. Sometimes the best conversations grow naturally because both people are listening instead of waiting for their turn to speak. That is also one of the easiest ways to become a better English speaker. When we truly listen, understanding becomes much easier than trying to remember perfect grammar. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a stack of cream-colored paper resting on one corner of his workbench. It looked exactly like the paper used for the Monday notes. I looked at it for only a second before turning away. Perhaps many people bought the same paper. Perhaps it meant nothing. Still, the thought stayed with me. The following Thursday evening, heavy rain fell across the city. Most people hurried home, but I stopped at the notice board before leaving the square. The latest message had become wet, and one corner had started to tear. Without thinking, I reached to protect it. At the exact same moment, another hand reached for the paper. I looked up. Callum stood beside me. For a second, we both laughed. "I didn't want the rain to ruin it," he said. Neither did I. Together, we carefully removed the paper and placed it inside a clear plastic folder that I carried for museum documents. "I always carry these," I explained. "It seems the note was lucky today," he replied. We stood beneath the flower shop roof while the rain became heavier. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. Finally, I looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you care so much about this notice board?" He remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "When I opened my workshop 5 years ago, almost nobody came." He looked toward the square. "I thought about closing the business." "What changed?" "One Monday morning I found a note on this board." He smiled softly. "It wasn't signed." "What did it say?" "It said, 'Someone believes in you, even if you cannot see them today.'" I listened without saying a word. "I never discovered who wrote it," he continued. "That one sentence gave me enough courage to keep going." A few months later, my business finally began to grow. I suddenly remembered Evelyn's words. "This square has given him more than he could ever repay." Now I finally understood. "So you wanted to thank the stranger?" He nodded gently. "I couldn't thank that person directly." He looked at the notice board. So I started writing my own Monday notes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The mystery that had followed me for weeks quietly disappeared. "You wrote them," I whispered. "I did." He looked almost embarrassed. "I wasn't planning to tell anyone." I smiled. "I'm glad you told me." He looked relieved. I almost stopped after the redevelopment notice appeared. "I know. I thought people had forgotten." I reached into my notebook and carefully unfolded the first anonymous reply. "I think this belongs to you." He looked at the paper and smiled. "I hoped you would read it. I've kept every note." His smile grew wider. "So have I." The following morning, another announcement appeared in the square. The old notice board would be removed the next day. People gathered around it with disappointed faces. Then something unexpected happened. The little boy who always came with his grandfather walked to the front carrying a small piece of paper. He pinned it beneath the official announcement. It simply said, "Please don't take away our Mondays." For a few seconds, everyone remained silent. Then the baker stepped forward and added another note. The nurse added one. The elderly couple added one. Within half an hour, dozens of handwritten messages covered the board. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had organized it. People simply wanted their voices to be heard. Watching them reminded me that kindness grows when people see it in others. Confidence grows in much the same way. One brave step often gives another person the courage to take their own. The next morning, the old notice board disappeared. For a moment, Maple Square looked empty. Then I heard the sound of hammering behind the flower shop. I followed the noise. Nearly 20 neighbors stood together building a new wooden board. Callum was helping, but he was not leading the project. The baker measured wooden posts. Evelyn painted the frame. The nurse handed out hot coffee. Children carefully decorated the edges with small painted leaves. It belonged to everyone. By midday, the new board stood proudly beneath the maple tree. Across the top, someone had carved a simple message: "Every voice matters." Callum handed me a blank sheet of paper. "I think you should write the first note." I looked around the square. Everyone waited quietly. I smiled and began writing. Kindness never asks who deserves it. It simply chooses to begin. If today's message gives you hope, leave a message for someone else next Monday. I pinned the paper to the center of the board. The little boy stepped forward next, then the nurse, then the baker. Soon the board filled with messages from people all across the neighborhood. No one asked who had written the first Monday note years ago. That mystery no longer mattered. The tradition had become larger than the person who started it. Almost a year later, Maple Square looked brighter than ever. Every Monday morning, people still gathered around the notice board before work. Some came to read, others came to write. Many simply came to smile. As Callum and I stood beneath the maple tree, the little boy pinned one final message before running to school. It read, "Someone answered my note. Today I answered someone else's." Callum looked at me and quietly smiled. I smiled back. In that moment, I realized the greatest stories are not always written by one person. Sometimes they begin with a single sentence, grow through many kind hearts, and continue long after the first writer has put down the pen. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.